When you hear the name Astor, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a name that feels less like a family and more like an institution, a word carved into the very marble of New York City. It conjures a sepia-toned vision of the Gilded Age, of glittering ballrooms in Fifth Avenue mansions, of formidable women in diamond tiaras, and stern men whose fortunes were so immense they seemed to bend the laws of gravity. The Astors were not just wealthy. They were the architects of American high society, the self-appointed royalty in a nation that had famously rejected a king. Their power was absolute, their influence inescapable. They were a dynasty built not on ancient bloodlines, but on a mountain of beaver pelts and a seemingly endless grid of Manhattan real estate, a financial empire so vast it felt as permanent as the bedrock of the island itself. This is the story of that dynasty, a name that became synonymous with a unique and almost terrifying concentration of American power, an empire built on ruthless ambition, shrewd intellect, and an unwavering belief in their own manifest destiny. Their influence quietly shaped the social hierarchies, the architectural landscape, and the very definition of aspiration in America for more than a century. We see the grand hotels, the public libraries, the exclusive social clubs, all stamped with the unmistakable Astor seal. But what if I told you the real story of the Astor family is not one of a simple linear ascent to greatness and a quiet, graceful fade? What if the true story is one of a spectacular, shattering, and deeply human implosion? Today we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on one of America's most accomplished and deeply cursed political dynasties. This is the story of how a name that once defined high society became a byword for public tragedy, private heartbreak, and a final unforgivable betrayal. We will journey from the icy black waters of the North Atlantic, where a patriarch met his end in a disaster that shook the world, to the lonely, gilded drawing rooms where an heiress searched for a love her fortune could never buy, and finally, into the silent, shadowed apartment of a beloved philanthropist, where the family's century of honor was sold for a pittance by her own flesh and blood. This is the story of the Astor family's downfall and the secret, terrible cost of the crown. To understand the spectacular collapse of the Astor dynasty, you must first immerse yourself in the world they meticulously created, an America on the anvil of modernity, being hammered into a new and terrifying shape. Imagine the landscape into which the family's destiny was forged, the raw, chaotic, and beautiful tapestry of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was an America grappling with its own identity in the aftermath of a bloody civil war, a nation hurtling into an age of untamed industrial capitalism. It was an era of sprawling cities black with coal smoke, where fortunes were made overnight and lost just as quickly, and where the gap between the impossibly rich and the desperately poor was a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. It was the era that Mark Twain, with his characteristic cynical wit, christened the Gilded Age, a time of staggering opulence and appalling squalor, where the rules of this new world were being written in the language of power, greed, and social exclusion. Picture walking down Fifth Avenue in the 1890s. The air is thick with the smell of coal dust and expensive perfume, the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone, punctuated by the distant, rumbling clang of the new elevated trains. You'd pass monumental limestone mansions, each one a fortress of wealth, their windows glowing like jewels in the gaslight. These weren't just homes, they were declarations, statements of power meant to awe and intimidate. Yet, just a short carriage ride away, you would find yourself in the teeming, desperate world of the Lower East Side, a labyrinth of crowded tenements where millions of new immigrants were packed into squalid rooms, their lives a daily struggle for survival. These two worlds, separated by only a few miles, might as well have been on different planets, and the undisputed rulers of the glittering planet of wealth were the Astors. It was in this crucible that the Astor name was not just respected, but revered. The family's patriarch, John Jacob Astor, had arrived from Germany in the late 18th century, and through a combination of ruthless business acumen in the fur trade and an almost clairvoyant vision for Manhattan real estate, had built the nation's first great fortune. He bought land when much of Manhattan was still fields and farmland, a move his contemporaries considered foolish. But Astor saw the future, and that future was a city that would grow relentlessly, a city where land would become more precious than gold. He was right, and his vision laid the foundation for an empire, but it was his descendants, particularly in the third and fourth generations, who transformed that wealth into something more potent, social power. You see, in this new American society, money alone wasn't enough. There were dozens of new money families, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, who had amassed staggering fortunes in railroads and shipping and finance. But the Astors had something they lacked, the patina of age. They were considered old money, and they used this status to become the ultimate gatekeepers. The undisputed arbiter of this power was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, universally known as the Mrs. Astor. She was not the wealthiest Astor, but she was the most formidable. She was the high priestess of New York society, a woman whose quiet disapproval could ruin a reputation more effectively than any financial disaster. It was she who created the infamous 400, the definitive list of New York society's elite, the chosen few who were deemed worthy of entering her magnificent ballroom. The number was not arbitrary. It was, quite simply, the number of people who could comfortably fit into her Fifth Avenue mansion. To be one of the 400 was to be at the absolute apex of the American social pyramid. To be excluded was to be a nobody, no matter how many millions you had in the bank. Imagine the anxiety, the desperate maneuvering, the strategic dinner parties, and calculated friendships, all undertaken with the singular goal of receiving that coveted cream-colored invitation. A single nod from Mrs. Astor could make a family. A subtle snub could break one. She was the architect of an invisible yet brutally effective social fortress. This was a world of rigid rules, of unspoken codes, and of suffocating expectations. It was a world that demanded conformity, propriety, and above all, the preservation of the family name. It was into this gilded, airless cage that John Jacob Jack Astor IV was born in 1864. He was, for all intents and purposes, a prince of this American kingdom. He inherited a personal fortune that would be valued in the billions today. From the moment he was born, his path seemed preordained. The best schools, the right clubs, an advantageous marriage, and a lifetime spent managing the family's ever-expanding portfolio of real estate. And for a time, he played the part perfectly. He was a product of the finest schools, a Harvard graduate who, unlike many of his indolent peers, possessed a restless and curious mind. He didn't just sit back and collect rent checks. He was an inventor with several patents to his name, including a pneumatic device for improving roads and a type of marine turbine. He was fascinated by the new technologies that were transforming the world: automobiles, flying machines, the very engines of progress. This inventive streak was perhaps a clue to the man beneath the aristocratic surface, a sign of a mind that yearned for logic and order in a world that often seemed governed by arbitrary and nonsensical rules. He was even a writer, penning a science fiction novel in 1894 called A Journey in Other Worlds. It's a fascinating and deeply revealing book. It tells the story of a future world in the year 2000 where humanity has harnessed the power of anti-gravity and travels to Jupiter and Saturn. But what's most telling is the kind of universe Astor imagined. It was a utopia, a world where technology had solved society's problems, a world of peace and rational order. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man who stood at the very pinnacle of earthly society, a man who had every material advantage one could dream of, and his fantasy was to escape to another planet, to a place far from the petty gossip, the rigid hierarchies, and the emotional emptiness of his own gilded world. His novel was a subconscious cry for freedom. He managed the family's vast real estate holdings, and he built some of New York's most luxurious and iconic hotels, including the Astoria Hotel. And the story of that hotel is a perfect illustration of the Astor family's internal dynamics. His cousin, William Waldorf Astor, was a notoriously difficult and prickly man who harbored a deep resentment for his aunt, the very same Caroline Astor who ruled society. In an act of pure spite, William tore down his own mansion on Fifth Avenue and built a massive, opulent hotel right next door to his aunt's home, hoping the noise and the commercial traffic would drive her mad. It was an act of architectural warfare. Not to be outdone, Jack Astor, who controlled the property on the other side of his great-aunt, responded with his own salvo. He built an even taller, even more luxurious hotel, the Astoria. For a time, these two monuments to family ego stood side by side, until cooler heads prevailed and they were joined by a grand corridor, creating the legendary Waldorf Astoria. It was a hotel born from a family feud. But for all his accomplishments, Jack Astor was also a man chafing under the constraints of the world he inhabited. He was a man of passions, and in the rigid, unforgiving society of the Gilded Age, passion was a dangerous and disruptive force. He served with distinction as a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War, but his true battle was always closer to home, against the stultifying expectations of his class. This internal conflict would ultimately lead to a decision that would create the first great public scandal of the Astor dynasty's 20th century story, a scandal that would drive him across the ocean and onto the deck of a doomed ship. You have to understand that in his world, marriage was not about love. It was a business transaction, a merger of fortunes and family lines. His own marriage to the beautiful Philadelphia socialite Ava Lowell Willing was a perfect example. They were a handsome couple. They produced 2 children, a son, Vincent, and a daughter, Ava Alice, and they performed their social duties with impeccable grace. But behind closed doors, the marriage was an emotional ice palace. Ava was a famously cold and controlling woman, and Jack was a man who craved warmth and affection. After years of quiet unhappiness, he did the unthinkable. In 1909, after 18 years of marriage, he divorced his first wife. In the cloistered, judgmental world of the 400, divorce was still a shocking and deeply stigmatizing event, a public admission of a private failure. It was a messy, ugly affair that was whispered about in every drawing room from New York to Newport. But it was what Astor did next that truly set society on its ear and turned him from a respected scion into a scandalous outcast. Just 2 years later, at the age of 47, he announced his intention to marry Madeline Talmage Force. Madeline was from a well-established family. She was poised and lovely, but she was also 18 years old. She was 29 years his junior, a full year younger than his own son Vincent. The reaction was immediate and vicious. This was not just an unconventional marriage. It was seen as a grotesque and almost immoral act, a flagrant violation of the social order. The press, sensing a story that had everything, wealth, power, sex, and scandal, was merciless. The vultures of the tabloid world descended, and they picked the story clean. The couple was hounded, their age difference the subject of endless jokes and sanctimonious editorials. The term robbing the cradle might as well have been invented for them. They were a national spectacle. High society, the very world his family had created, turned its back on him. The fortress that his great-aunt had built was now sealed against him. Ministers refused to marry them, claiming the union was an affront to God. They had to search desperately for a clergyman willing to perform the ceremony, finally finding one in Newport who agreed to do it in the quiet seclusion of a private mansion. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. Invitations stopped arriving. The silent, brutal machinery of social exclusion, which the Astors had perfected, was now turned upon one of its own. The gilded cage had slammed shut. To escape the relentless public condemnation, Jack and his teenage bride embarked on a long, extended honeymoon to Europe and Egypt. It was a self-imposed exile, a grand tour designed to let the scandal blow over, to allow time for society's short memory and insatiable appetite for new gossip to work its magic. They traveled for months, a lonely, isolated couple surrounded by luxury but shunned by their peers. One can only imagine the immense pressure on the young Madeline, a teenager thrust into the center of an international scandal, married to a man the age of her father, and cut off from everything she had ever known. But during their travels, something wonderful happened. By the spring of 1912, Madeline was pregnant. They were overjoyed, and they shared a powerful, urgent desire. Their child must be born on American soil. It was time to go home, to face the world they had fled, armed with the hope that the coming of a new baby would soften society's hardened heart. And so, for their return journey, they booked a first-class suite on the grandest, most celebrated, and most technologically advanced vessel of the age, a ship that was being hailed as a floating testament to man's mastery over nature. It was the ship of dreams, a vessel so safe, so strong, it was said that God himself could not sink her. They booked their passage home on the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was more than just a ship. It was a perfect microcosm of the Edwardian world, a floating hierarchical society sailing through the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. It was a meticulously crafted stage set for the final act of the Gilded Age. You have to imagine the sheer, breathtaking scale of it. First-class passengers entered through a reception room of gleaming white wood paneling, ascending the grand staircase, a masterpiece of polished oak and wrought iron, crowned by a magnificent glass dome that flooded the landing with light. They could take tea in the veranda cafe, surrounded by live palm trees, or read in the Georgian-style library, warmed by a crackling fire. They could swim in a heated indoor pool or work out in a state-of-the-art gymnasium. It was a world of unimaginable comfort and luxury, designed to insulate its inhabitants from the harsh realities of the outside world. But this was only one part of the story. Far below the decks, in the cramped, noisy, and Spartan confines of third class or steerage, was another world entirely. Here, hundreds of immigrants from across Europe were packed into basic dormitories, dreaming of a new life in America. They ate simple food at long communal tables and had access to only 2 bathtubs for more than 700 people. The distance between the first-class suites and the steerage cabins was only a few dozen vertical feet, but in social terms, it was a journey of 1,000 miles. This was the world in miniature, with its rigid class divisions, its vast inequalities, and its shared, and ultimately fatal belief in its own invincibility. In its opulent first-class suites, dining rooms, and smoking lounges, the titans of the Gilded Age recreated their world of privilege and comfort. And among these titans, none was more prominent than Colonel John Jacob Astor IV. He was, by a considerable margin, the wealthiest passenger on board. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, a sum that today would be worth well over $2.5 billion. He and his young pregnant wife were the subject of intense fascination and quiet gossip among their fellow travelers. They were a living, breathing scandal, a romance that had defied convention, and now they were sailing home to face the world they had fled. For the first few days of the voyage, life aboard the Titanic was idyllic. The weather was clear, the sea was calm, and the ship moved with a speed and smoothness that seemed to confirm its invincibility. For Jack and Madeline, it must have felt like a brief, blessed respite from the storm of public opinion. The vastness of the ocean provided a kind of anonymity they could never find on land. Here, surrounded by the quiet hum of the engines and the endless expanse of the sea, they weren't a scandal. They were just another wealthy couple. They brought along their beloved Airedale Terrier, Kitty, who traveled in the ship's state-of-the-art kennels, and they would visit her daily. They strolled the enclosed promenade deck, Madeline wrapped in furs against the crisp sea air, and took their meals in the lavish a la carte restaurant, a space designed to feel like the Ritz in Paris. One can imagine Astor, a man with a deep interest in technology, being fascinated by the ship itself, its powerful engines, its Marconi wireless room that crackled with messages from a world away, its sheer unprecedented scale. He was a man of the future, sailing on the ship of the future. The night of April 14th, 1912, was preternaturally calm and bitterly cold. The sea was as flat as a sheet of glass, a rare and dangerous condition in the North Atlantic, as it made spotting icebergs more difficult. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless canopy of stars, but there was no moon. It was in this strange, beautiful, and treacherous stillness that disaster struck. Shortly before midnight, the great ship, which had been racing across the ocean at a near-record speed, struck an iceberg. The impact was described by many survivors as surprisingly gentle, a slight shudder, a grinding noise that was unsettling but not immediately alarming. Many passengers slept right through it. In the first-class smoking room, men who were finishing a late-night game of cards barely looked up. Astor himself was reportedly awake in his palatial suite when it happened. He went to investigate and was told by a steward that the ship had struck ice but that there was no danger. He returned to his wife, reassuring her. But as the minutes ticked by and the ship began to develop a noticeable list, and the quiet, rhythmic thrum of the engines fell silent, replaced by an eerie, unnatural quiet, it became clear that this was no minor incident. A deeper, more urgent vibration of wrongness began to spread through the vessel. The story of Jack Astor's final hours is a testament to a kind of quiet, aristocratic courage that the world was about to lose forever. As the order was given for passengers to don life belts and make their way to the boat deck, Astor remained a figure of immense calm. He moved with a deliberation that seemed to reassure those around him. He helped his young, terrified wife into her life belt, and in a moment of tender, practical reassurance, he took out a small penknife and cut the lining to show her the soft cork inside. He escorted her and her maid to the chaotic, crowded boat deck, navigating through the confused and frightened passengers with a quiet authority. He found a place for them near Lifeboat 4, on the port side of the ship, which was slow to be loaded. He waited with them, a steadfast and calming presence amidst the rising panic. Here, in the freezing cold, Under the light of the emergency rockets that were now firing into the empty sky, their white sparks cascading down into the black water, the rigid social order of the Gilded Age was both enforced and shattered. The rule of the sea, women and children first, became the final, absolute law. It was a code of chivalry that the men of Astor's class had always paid lip service to, and now, in the face of death, they were called upon to live it. As Madeline was being helped into the lifeboat, Astor asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller if he might be allowed to join her. He did not demand it. He did not flash his money. He simply made a quiet request, citing his wife's delicate condition. Lightoller, a man of rigid discipline who was interpreting the evacuation order to mean women and children only, refused. He was a man haunted by a previous shipwreck and was determined to follow the rules to the letter, a decision that would save many but also doom others who might have found space in the half-empty lifeboats he launched. He told Astor that no men were allowed in the boats until all the women were off the ship. The stories of what happened next have become part of the Titanic legend. Astor did not argue. He did not protest. He simply accepted the officer's verdict with a nod. He stepped back from the railing, giving his wife a final reassuring look. He asked for the number of the lifeboat, so he might find her later, a poignant expression of a hope that he must have known was in vain. He threw his leather gloves into the boat for her to use. Some survivors reported that he then turned to his valet and, seeing the look of terror in his eyes, made a small joke. He then reportedly made his way to the ship's kennels and released his dog, Kitty, a final small act of compassion in a world that was rapidly descending into chaos. The last anyone ever saw of him, he was standing on the rapidly tilting deck, smoking a cigarette and chatting with the writer Jacques Futrelle, another prominent man who had also accepted his fate. They were two gentlemen of a dying age, facing the end with the stoic, almost indifferent courage that their class had always prized above all else. His body was recovered from the sea by the cable ship McKay Bennett more than a week later. The official report noted that he was not disfigured, and in his pockets the searchers found a gold watch, a diamond ring, cufflinks, and a wallet containing a significant amount of American and British currency. His fortune was intact, but it had been utterly useless. The death of John Jacob Astor IV was a profound shock to the world. It was a front-page story in every newspaper, a tragedy that seemed to symbolize the end of an era of boundless optimism and technological hubris. The richest man in America had perished in the greatest maritime disaster in history, but in the aftermath of the tragedy, as the world struggled to comprehend the scale of the loss, a darker, more insidious narrative began to take shape, a rumor that would attach itself to Astor's name and tarnish his heroic end. It was the story that he had tried to bribe his way to safety. This rumor, which seems to have appeared within days of the sinking, took on a life of its own. It was printed in sensationalist newspapers, repeated in gossip columns, and whispered in drawing rooms on both sides of the Atlantic. The story alleged that Astor, in a desperate attempt to save himself, had offered a ship's officer a vast sum of money to secure a place for himself in a lifeboat. It was a story that perfectly captured the public's deep-seated ambivalence towards the ultra-rich. You have to remember the context of the times. This was the height of the progressive era, a time of trust-busting and rising anti-monopolist sentiment. Men like Astor, Carnegie, and Rockefeller were seen by many not as captains of industry, but as robber barons, men who had built their fortunes on the backs of the working class. The public was primed to believe the worst of them. The bribery story confirmed their suspicions that in a moment of crisis, a man like Astor would naturally resort to the one tool he had always used to get his way, his money. The fact that J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, had survived by stepping into one of the last lifeboats had already created a firestorm of public outrage. He was branded a coward for the rest of his life. For the men of the Gilded Age elite, the Titanic created an impossible situation. To survive was to be a coward. To die was to be suspected of trying to buy your way out. The truth is that there is not a single piece of credible first-hand evidence to support this accusation. Every reliable eyewitness account, including the sworn testimony of Second Officer Lightoller at the official inquiries, portrays Astor as a model of composure and quiet heroism. The rumor was almost certainly a fabrication, a piece of yellow journalism designed to sell newspapers. But its persistence tells us a great deal about the precarious position the Astor dynasty held in the public imagination. They were admired, but not loved. They were seen as powerful, but also as corrupt. A family whose vast fortune was somehow tainted. The bribery rumor was a reflection of the class tensions that simmered just beneath the glittering surface of the Gilded Age. Tensions that the Titanic disaster had brought to a boil. The true victim of the disaster, in many ways, was the young woman who survived it. Madeline Astor returned to New York a 19-year-old widow, her life forever defined by that one night of unimaginable terror. She was rescued from the icy sea, but she was plunged into a different kind of cold, unforgiving ocean, the world of New York high society. She gave birth to a son, John Jacob Astor VI, a few months later. But her life would be a long and difficult one. She was the tragic Titanic widow, a figure of public sympathy. But in the cold, unforgiving world of high society, she remained an outsider. The Astor family, who had never fully accepted her, now kept her at a formal, chilly distance. Her own stepson, Vincent Astor, who was a year older than she was, now controlled the family's main fortune, and he reportedly treated her with a correct but distant courtesy. She was a living, breathing reminder of the scandal that had tarnished the family name, and the cruel codicil in her husband's will, which stripped her of her inheritance if she remarried, was a constant looming presence. It was not just a suggestion. It was a financial and social weapon. The will left her the income from a $5 million trust fund and the use of their Fifth Avenue mansion, but only as long as she remained the widow of Astor. It was a golden chain, designed with cold legal precision to keep her and her portion of the Astor fortune under the family's control and to prevent that money from ever passing into the hands of another man, another family. Imagine her position, a 19-year-old girl, a new mother, traumatized and grieving, now trapped in a magnificent prison, her future dictated by the dead hand of a man she had only known for a short time. After 4 years of lonely widowhood, she made a choice. She chose love, or at least the hope of it, over money. She remarried a childhood friend, and the moment she said, "I do," the golden chain snapped. The Astor Trust Fund was gone. The Fifth Avenue mansion was gone. She was cast out of the Astor orbit forever. She would never fully escape the shadow of the Titanic or the name of the man she had lost in the icy abyss. Her story and the scandalous rumors that surrounded her husband's death marked the first great public fracture in the dynasty's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. The unsinkable family had struck an iceberg, and though the full extent of the damage was not yet visible, the Astors were beginning to take on water. While the world was fixated on the epic cinematic tragedy of the Titanic and the heroic death of its wealthiest passenger, a different, more insidious kind of tragedy was quietly unfolding within the next generation of the Astor family. This was a slow, creeping, and deeply personal disaster, a story that lacked the drama of a sinking ship, but was, in its own way, far more devastating. It was a story about the corrosive, soul-crushing emptiness that can lie at the heart of immense unearned wealth. This was the story of Ava Alice Muriel Astor, the only daughter of John Jacob Astor IV and his first wife, the formidable socialite Ava Lowell Willing. Her life was a long and desperate search for meaning in a world that had given her everything but a reason to exist. Born in 1902, Ava Alice was a princess of the American Gilded Age in every sense of the word. Her childhood was a blur of unimaginable luxury, a procession of Fifth Avenue mansions, sprawling seaside cottages in Newport, and grand European tours. You have to imagine what that was like for a small child. Home wasn't a place of warmth and comfort. It was a museum, a series of cavernous, echoing rooms filled with priceless art and heavy ornate furniture. It was a world run by a silent army of servants, nannies, governesses, maids, and butlers, who catered to her every physical need but were incapable of providing the simple, unconditional love a child craves. She was educated by private tutors, dressed in the finest Parisian clothes, and her every whim was catered to. She was raised in a world that was as artificial as it was opulent, a world where emotion was suppressed, duty was paramount, and the preservation of the family's good name was the highest virtue. Her parents were less like caregivers and more like distant, powerful monarchs. Her father, John Jacob Astor IV, was a man of intellect and private passions, but he was often absent, engrossed in his business ventures, his inventions, and his own social obligations. Her mother, Ava Lowell Willing, was the quintessential society grande dame, beautiful, impeccably dressed, and emotionally frozen. She was a woman who valued propriety above all else, who believed that the public display of emotion was a sign of poor breeding. For a sensitive, intelligent child like Ava Alice, this environment was a kind of emotional desert. It was a childhood of immense material privilege and profound emotional neglect. But from a very early age, it was clear that Ava was not cut from the same cloth as her stoic, socially ambitious parents. She was a deeply sensitive, intelligent, and restless child, with a creative and spiritual yearning that found no outlet in the rigid, superficial world of high society. The death of her father on the Titanic when she was just 10 years old was the defining trauma of her life. It's difficult to overstate the psychological impact of such an event. It wasn't just that her father was gone, it was the way he was taken. His death was a global spectacle, a story of horror and heroism splashed across the front page of every newspaper in the world. Imagine being a 10-year-old girl trying to process your own private grief while the entire world is consuming your family's tragedy as a form of public entertainment. The disaster likely shattered her fragile sense of security, teaching her at a very young age that for all the family's wealth and power, the world was a fundamentally chaotic and dangerous place. The gilded walls of her mansion were no protection against the cold, indifferent abyss. It was a loss that was both deeply personal and strangely abstract. He was a figure she had known more through his public persona than through any real intimacy. His death, however, transformed her. She and her older brother Vincent inherited the bulk of their father's colossal fortune, instantly becoming two of the wealthiest children on the planet. This inheritance, however, was not a gift. It was a life sentence. It was a golden albatross that would hang around her neck for the rest of her days, defining her, isolating her, and ultimately destroying her. Suddenly, she was no longer just Ava Astor. She was one of the Titanic orphans, a label that would follow her forever, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had shaped her. Her entire adult life can be seen as a series of desperate and ultimately failed attempts to escape the gilded cage of her own name. This rebellion put her on a direct collision course with her older brother Vincent. He was the dutiful son, the pragmatist, the heir who accepted the immense responsibility of his inheritance with a grim sense of duty. He embraced his role as the new head of the family, dedicating himself to managing the Astor fortune, and later in life to a quiet and serious form of philanthropy. Vincent saw the family name as a sacred trust. Ava saw it as a prison. He was the anchor. She was the storm. Their relationship was a complex mix of sibling affection and deep fundamental opposition. He was often baffled and exasperated by her choices, by her chaotic personal life, and her willingness to pour vast sums of money into what he considered frivolous and eccentric pursuits. To Vincent, she was a constant source of anxiety, a wild card who threatened the family's carefully curated reputation. To Ava, Vincent was a symbol of the very world she was trying to escape, a world of duty, tradition, and emotional restraint. While her brother Vincent embraced his role as the new head of the family, dedicating himself to business and later to philanthropy, Ava rebelled. She had no interest in managing the family fortune or in playing the role of the dutiful society heiress. She was searching for something more, something real, and her search led her down a long and winding road of romantic and spiritual disillusionment. Her primary vehicle for escape was through men. Her romantic history is a catalog of passionate beginnings and disastrous endings. She married 4 times, and each marriage was a public spectacle that ended in a bitter and often scandalous divorce. In 1924, at the age of 22, she married Prince Serge Obolensky. He was a dashing, impossibly charming exiled Russian aristocrat, a man who had lost his fortune in the Bolshevik Revolution, but had retained his title and his immense charisma. On the surface, it was a fairy tale match, a union of old-world titles and new-world money. They were the it couple of the Roaring Twenties, their glamorous lives chronicled in every society column. They were beautiful, wealthy, and moved in a world of endless parties, jazz clubs, and artistic salons. The press was enthralled, but the fairy tale quickly turned into a nightmare. The public image of the glamorous couple hid a much darker private reality. Serge was a charismatic and exciting partner, but he was also a restless and reportedly unfaithful husband. The marriage was a collision of 2 deeply wounded and mismatched souls. He was a man haunted by the loss of his homeland. She was a woman haunted by the emptiness of her own life. They had 2 children together, a son Ivan and a daughter Sylvia. But the union was marked by explosive arguments and a fundamental incompatibility. After 8 years, the glamorous couple divorced, and Ava was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered fairy tale. Her subsequent marriages followed a similar pattern. Each began with a whirlwind of passion and hope, a belief that this time she had finally found the connection she so desperately craved, and each ended in disappointment and public humiliation. Her second husband was a financial consultant, her third, a British journalist, her fourth, an English architect. With each new marriage and each messy divorce, she became more of a caricature in the public eye, the poor little rich girl who couldn't find happiness. The newspapers chronicled her romantic failures with a kind of sadistic glee, portraying her as a flighty, unstable dilettante. But the reality was far more tragic. Ava wasn't flighty. She was lost. She was a woman who had been given no tools to navigate the real world, a woman who used men as a way to feel something, anything, other than the profound emptiness that lay at the core of her being. Each marriage was a failed experiment in identity, an attempt to find a version of herself that felt real, only to discover that she was still trapped inside the same gilded cage. One of the least understood and most revealing aspects of Ava's life was her deep and lifelong engagement with the world of spirituality and the occult. This was not a casual hobby. It was a desperate, all-consuming quest for enlightenment. She became a devoted follower of the controversial and enigmatic spiritual teacher, George Gurdjieff, a Greek-Armenian mystic who taught a complex system of self-awareness he called the work. You have to understand the appeal of a philosophy like this to someone like Ava. Gurdjieff taught that most people live their lives in a state of waking sleep. Their personality's nothing more than a collection of conditioned reflexes and inherited roles. The goal of the work was to shatter this false self and awaken to a higher state of consciousness, to find one's real I. For a woman whose entire identity was an inherited role, a public construct named Ava Astor, this idea must have been electrifying. It offered her the hope of becoming a real person. Ava poured vast sums of her fortune into supporting Gurdjieff's communes and institutes, both in France and America. She was also deeply interested in Buddhism, astrology, and various other esoteric traditions. She surrounded herself with gurus, mystics, and spiritual seekers, hoping that they held the key to unlocking the peace that she could not find within herself. She traveled the world, from the spiritual salons of Paris to the ashrams of India, always searching, always seeking. This spiritual quest was, of course, just another form of escape. It was an attempt to transcend the material world that she found so suffocating. It was the journey of a woman who had been given every material object she could ever desire, only to discover that none of it had any real value. She had a Fifth Avenue mansion, but she didn't have a home. She had the Astor fortune, but she didn't have a self. Her spiritual seeking was a profound and poignant cry for help, a sign of a soul that was starving in the midst of plenty. Her brother Vincent, a practical and unsentimental man, was famously exasperated by what he saw as her foolishness. He once reportedly remarked, "My sister has spent over $1 million on gurus, and she's still not happy." It was a cruel but perhaps not inaccurate assessment. From his perspective, she was squandering the family legacy. From her perspective, she was trying to build a soul. Her relationships with her own children were also strained and difficult. How could they not be? She loved them, but she was a distant and often inconsistent mother, too caught up in her own emotional turmoil to provide them with the stability and security they needed. She sent them to the best boarding schools, gave them everything money could buy, but she was often physically and emotionally absent, off on another spiritual quest, or caught in the drama of another failing marriage. She was, in many ways, still a child herself, forever searching for the paternal love and approval that had been snatched away from her on that cold April night in 1912. She was incapable of giving her children what she herself had never received. Ava Alice Astor died in 1956 after suffering a stroke in her Manhattan apartment. She was only 54 years old. Her death was a quiet and lonely one, a sad end to a life that had been lived so loudly. She left behind a vast fortune, but her true legacy was a more intangible and tragic one. Her life serves as a powerful and devastating cautionary tale about the unique burdens of inherited wealth. She was a victim of what is sometimes called affluenza, a spiritual malaise that can afflict those who are born with everything and therefore have nothing to strive for. Her story is a stark reminder that a life without purpose, a life without struggle, can become a prison more confining than any poverty. She was the Astor dynasty's hidden wound, the ghost that haunted its Gilded Age ballrooms. Her quiet, slow-motion tragedy revealed the deep spiritual bankruptcy that lay just beneath the family's glittering, golden surface. The unsinkable dynasty was not just taking on water, it was rotting from the inside out. As the 20th century wore on, the Astor dynasty, once the undisputed royalty of American society, seemed to be settling into a long and graceful fade. The great Gilded Age mansions had been torn down to make way for skyscrapers. The colossal fortune had been splintered by taxes and time, and the family name, while still resonant, no longer held the same earth-shaking power. The era of the Astors as a history-shaping force seemed to be over, and then, just when it seemed the dynasty was destined to become a dusty footnote in the history books, came Brooke Astor. She was the family's improbable and spectacular third act, a woman who would not only restore the luster to the tarnished Astor name, but would elevate it to a level of public adoration and moral authority that it had never known before. Her remarkable life and her immense contribution to the city of New York make the final sordid chapter of the dynasty's fall all the more shocking, all the more enraging, and all the more tragic. She was not born an Astor. Roberta Brooke Russell was born in 1902 into a family of distinguished but not particularly wealthy military men. She married into the dynasty in 1953, becoming the third wife of the notoriously difficult and reclusive Vincent Astor, the son of John Jacob Astor IV, who had been spared his father's fate on the Titanic. You have to understand who Vincent Astor was to grasp the significance of what came next. He was a man who had lived his entire life under a shadow. His famous father had died a hero's death when he was just a boy, leaving him with an impossible legacy to live up to. He inherited a colossal fortune and the immense burden of the Astor name. He was a deeply shy, awkward, and often melancholic man, uncomfortable in the high society world he was supposed to rule. He was famously gruff and unsentimental, a man who seemed to take little joy from his immense wealth. By the time he married Brooke, Vincent was in his 60s. Brooke, a woman of immense charm, intelligence, and social grace, had been married and divorced twice before. She was not a starry-eyed ingenue. She was a woman who had lived, who understood the complexities of the human heart, and she brought a warmth and companionship into Vincent's lonely life that he had never known. Their marriage lasted just 5.5 years before Vincent died of a heart attack in 1959. Upon his death, Vincent did something that stunned the Astor clan and New York society. He left the entirety of his vast personal fortune, valued at over $60 million at the time, the equivalent of more than $500 million today, not to his distant Astor relatives, but directly and personally to his wife Brooke. This was more than just an act of love. It was an act of rebellion. It was Vincent's final posthumous verdict on the Astor bloodline that had brought him so little happiness. He bypassed them all, and instead he placed his trust and his family's legacy in the hands of the woman who had made his last years bearable. And he left it with a simple yet world-altering instruction. She was to take control of the Vincent Astor Foundation and use the money for the alleviation of human misery. In a single posthumous act, Vincent Astor had transformed his society hostess wife into one of the most powerful and influential philanthropists in the world. He had given her the keys to the Astor kingdom and charged her with the sacred duty of giving it all away. It was a burden that could have easily crushed a lesser person, but Brooke Astor rose to the occasion with a dedication, a flair, and a sense of joyous purpose that was nothing short of miraculous. For the next 4 decades, she became the undisputed grand dame of New York philanthropy. She was not a remote check-signing benefactor sitting on a distant board. She was a hands-on, deeply engaged philanthropist, a woman who insisted on personally visiting every organization that received a grant from her foundation. She became a beloved and ubiquitous figure in New York City, famous for her impeccable style, her signature white gloves and elegant hats, and her sharp, often self-deprecating wit. But she was most famous for her genuine, palpable compassion. There are thousands of stories that attest to her personal touch. She didn't just fund projects, she inhabited them. She would visit a struggling library in the South Bronx, and upon seeing the worn-out books, would ask the children what stories they dreamed of reading. She would tour a settlement house for the elderly and sit for hours, listening to the residents' stories, holding their hands, making them feel seen and valued. She once famously danced with a homeless man at a shelter she was funding. She believed that philanthropy was not about charity, but about dignity. Her approach was a throwback to a more personal, more human kind of giving, a stark contrast to the often cold and bureaucratic world of modern foundations. She gave away hundreds of millions of dollars, and her name became synonymous with the city's most cherished cultural institutions. The New York Public Library, whose iconic stone lions she considered her pets, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she endowed entire galleries, the American Museum of Natural History, the Bronx Zoo. She was, as she was often called, New York's fairy godmother, a living testament to the idea that great wealth could be a force for immense and transformative good. In a remarkable act of personal alchemy, she single-handedly took the Astor name, a name that had been built on ruthless capitalism and social exclusion, and she laundered it, transforming it into a beacon of civic virtue and public generosity. By the time she celebrated her 100th birthday in 2002 at a lavish party, hosted by David Rockefeller, she was not just a socialite, she was a secular saint, a woman who was universally and deservedly adored. But behind this radiant public facade, in the quiet, lavishly decorated rooms of her Park Avenue apartment, a private horror story was beginning to unfold. As Brooke entered her late 90s and then her early hundreds, the inevitable frailties of extreme old age began to take their toll. She grew physically weak, and the brilliant, incisive mind that had once charmed presidents and captivated artists began to fade, clouded by the cruel, creeping fog of Alzheimer's disease. And as she became more and more vulnerable, she became increasingly reliant on her only child, her son from her first marriage, Anthony Tony Dryden Marshall. Tony Marshall was a man who had lived his entire life in the long and imposing shadow of his mother. He had a respectable career as a U.S. ambassador and a Tony Award-winning Broadway producer, but he could never escape the fact that he was, first and foremost, Brooke Astor's son. Their relationship, by many accounts, was a strained and difficult one, marked by his resentment and her perceived emotional distance. Brooke was a demanding and often critical mother. Tony, in turn, was a son who seemed to forever be seeking an approval he could never quite earn. This lifetime of perceived slights, of feeling like a supporting actor in the grand drama of his mother's life, seems to have festered into a deep and poisonous resentment. As Brooke's mind and body began to fail, Tony, along with his third wife, Charlene, a woman many in Brooke's inner circle disliked and distrusted, took complete control of her life, her care, and her colossal fortune. Charlene, in particular, was seen as a grasping and ambitious figure, a stark contrast to the old-world grace of Brooke's friends. And it was then that the final, unforgivable betrayal began. The first whispers of trouble came from Brooke's devoted, long-serving staff. They spoke of a shocking and deliberate campaign of neglect. They told stories of the great lady, a woman for whom elegance and dignity had been a religion. being left in soiled clothes for hours. They spoke of her beloved dogs, her constant companions being taken from her. They whispered that she was being forced to sleep on a urine-stained sofa in her drafty library because her son and his wife had closed off her comfortable bedroom. Then, more sinister rumors began to emerge. Tony, it was alleged, was not just neglecting his mother, he was actively and systematically plundering her estate. He was accused of selling off her treasured artworks, including a beloved Childe Hassam painting that hung in her library, and diverting the proceeds into his own accounts. The cruelty of this particular act was breathtaking. He allegedly had a color photocopy of the painting made and placed back in the original frame, hoping that in her dementia-addled state, she would never notice her favorite painting was gone. He was accused of firing her loyal and trusted advisors and replacing them with his own compliant cronies. And most damningly of all, he was accused of taking advantage of his mother's dementia to manipulate her into changing her will, signing over millions of dollars that had been earmarked for her favorite charities directly to him and his wife. For years, this was just vicious gossip, the dark rumors that circulated in the rarefied air of New York's high society. But in the summer of 2006, the whispers exploded into a public roar. The scandal broke open when Brooke's own grandson, Philip Marshall, a respected university professor, took the courageous and personally devastating step of filing a lawsuit against his own father. Philip had witnessed his grandmother's decline and the increasingly disturbing behavior of his father and stepmother. His decision to act was an agonizing one. It meant publicly accusing his own father of monstrous crimes, and it would tear his family apart forever. But he felt he had no choice. It was a final, desperate attempt to uphold the legacy of honor that his grandmother had spent her life building. The lawsuit was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the city. It was a declaration of war within the Astor dynasty, a battle that would pit son against father and grandson against both for the soul and the fortune of a helpless and beloved matriarch. The court case that followed was a long, ugly, and deeply sordid affair. It laid bare the private agony of a public icon. A parade of Brooke's famous and powerful friends, including Annette de la Renta, the wife of designer Oscar de la Renta, and the venerable statesman Henry Kissinger, testified on her behalf. They painted a horrifying picture of a frail, confused, and utterly neglected woman. Mrs. de la Renta testified, with tears in her eyes, that she had visited her old friend and found her in a state of squalor, her hair unkempt, wearing a tattered nightgown, her once sparkling eyes now vacant and filled with fear. A nurse testified that Tony Marshall had callously cut his mother's medical budget, refused to pay for necessary dental work, and had taken away her favorite, expensive brand of pâté, replacing it with a cheaper alternative. It was a story of 1,000 small, calculated cruelties, a slow, methodical stripping away of a great lady's dignity for the sake of a few extra dollars. The trial became a media sensation, a real-life Shakespearean tragedy playing out in a Manhattan courtroom. Here was the beloved queen, lost in the labyrinth of dementia. Here was the grasping, resentful son, accused of a monstrous betrayal. And here was the heroic grandson, fighting to restore his grandmother's honor. Tony Marshall and his wife Charlene vehemently denied the accusations, insisting they had done nothing but care for an elderly and difficult woman as best they could. But the weight of the evidence against them was crushing. In the midst of this brutal legal spectacle, on August 13th, 2007, Brooke Astor died at Holly Hill, her beloved country estate. She was 105 years old. She passed away without ever fully comprehending the extent of her son's treachery or the public war that was being waged in her name. Her death, however, did not end the legal battle. It escalated it. The case was now a criminal matter. In October of 2009, after a sensational 6-month trial that had captivated the city, a jury found Anthony Marshall guilty of 14 out of 16 counts, including first-degree grand larceny and scheming to defraud. He was convicted of stealing millions of dollars from his own mother and of fraudulently manipulating her will. The judge, in sentencing the then 85-year-old Marshall, spoke of his epic greed and his cold-blooded crimes. He was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison. The only son of the woman who had become the very symbol of philanthropic grace had been officially branded a common thief. It was a fall from grace so complete, so shocking it seemed almost unbelievable. Due to endless appeals and his own failing health, he would ultimately serve only 60 days in prison before being granted medical parole. He died in 2004, a convicted felon, his name forever stained by his crime. The Brooke Astor scandal was more than just a tragic story of elder abuse. It was the final, pathetic, and ignominious end of the Astor dynasty. The great family fortune, which had been built on the ruthless exploitation of animals and land, and then spectacularly redeemed through a century of unprecedented generosity, had ended up as the motive for a squalid and shameful crime. The story of Brooke's betrayal was a heartbreaking testament to the fact that the most monstrous acts are often not committed by strangers, but by those who are supposed to love us the most. It was a story of a son's bottomless greed, his deep-seated resentment, and his ultimate failure to honor the mother who had given him everything. The name Astor, a name that had once stood for American royalty, for Gilded Age power, and for philanthropic grace, would now and forever also stand for a final bitter and inescapable truth, that even the greatest of fortunes is no defense against the profound and often terrifying darkness of the human heart. Looking back across the long, tumultuous sweep of the centuries, the story of the Astor dynasty emerges as a powerful, poignant, and deeply American saga. It is a story of dizzying heights and devastating falls, of public triumphs and private torments. It is not a simple linear narrative of a family's rise and decline, but a dramatic and often tragic exploration of the complex relationship between wealth, power, and the human soul. It is a story that forces us to confront the immense and often crushing weight of a family name that became synonymous with both the American dream and its darkest, most corrosive nightmares. The dynasty's fall from grace was not a single cataclysmic event, but a slow generational unraveling, a series of fractures that revealed the deep structural flaws that lay beneath the gilded surface. The death of John Jacob Astor IV on the Titanic was the first great shock, a moment when the family's carefully constructed myth of invincibility was shattered by a random and indifferent act of nature. He was a man who embodied the contradictions of his era, a forward-thinking innovator and a prisoner of social convention, a man who lived a life of scandalous indulgence but died a death of quiet, selfless heroism. His story and the ugly rumors that clung to it revealed the deep ambivalence that has always defined America's relationship with its aristocrats. His daughter Ava Alice represents the dynasty's internal decay, the spiritual hollowness that can fester in the heart of great wealth. Her life was a long, sad, and ultimately fruitless search for an identity that was not defined by her bank account. She was the ghost at the dynasty's banquet, a haunting reminder that a life without purpose, a life without struggle, can become a gilded prison, and that all the money in the world cannot fill the void of an empty soul. Her quiet, personal tragedy was a foreshadowing of the moral bankruptcy that was to come. And finally, there is the heartbreaking story of Brooke Astor. She was the dynasty's great redeemer, the woman who, through an act of sheer will and boundless generosity, almost single-handedly saved the family's legacy from the dustbin of history. She took a name that had become a symbol of Gilded Age excess, and she transformed it into a beacon of civic virtue, which is precisely why her final years represent such a profound and sickening betrayal. The crime committed against her by her own son was not just a theft of money, it was a theft of honor, a desecration of the very legacy she had so painstakingly built. It was the final squalid act in the dynasty's long and sorry decline, a moment when the last vestiges of grace were extinguished by the basest of human motives. So, what is the ultimate legacy of the Astors? They left their name on our cities, on our libraries, on our grand hotels. They wrote the rule book for American high society and for a time held a nation in their thrall. But their more enduring legacy is a more complicated and cautionary one. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that great fortunes are often easier to make than they are to sustain, not financially, but spiritually. It shows us how the ferocious world-conquering ambition of one generation can, over time, curdle into the indolence, the aimlessness, and ultimately the moral corruption of the next. It reveals the immense and often unbearable burden of inheritance and the eternal universal tension between the life we are given and the life we ultimately choose for ourselves.